What's up, Motorheads? Welcome to F1 Brake Check. For those of you who may have already been following us for a little bit, we are changing the name up a little bit. We kind of got to thinking that the original title was a little too long-winded, so kind of like your host here. So we're going to rename ourselves to Brake Check and just kind of give it a whole fresh new spin. So I'm Scott Vick, one of your intrepid hosts. With me, as always, is my co-host Corey Brune, where we're going to talk about the latest rounds of the F1 World Championship, but we're also going to put it in historical perspective and talk about the latest racing technologies. Corey, how you doing today?
Well, I live in Texas, U.S., so hot.
Yes.
So always hot around this time
Absolutely.
frame. But the F1 season is just phenomenal.
Yes. Living also here in Texas, it's definitely tire melting hot here.
Yeah.
You definitely do not want to use the softs right now.
Yeah, it's what 35, 36 degrees Celsius, anywhere from 97 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So depending on where you are in the world, it's hot. It's hot here
Yes,
in Texas.
it's very, very hot. All right, so we're going to be talking about Spain today and doing a little recap of the action from Spain, coming to us from the beautiful Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya, which I have never gotten to see or drive, but I have driven that course on the simulator a ton. Beautiful track, just absolutely gorgeous. It's got just such a great mix of high speed corners, with some really challenging corners and everything. Just a beautiful place.
Yeah, it's a fantastic track, and them reprofiling the last corner, it made it that much better of a track.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things. Definitely that last corner reprofiling and making it a much higher speed. I
Yeah.
cannot wait till the newer versions of Forza and stuff come out with the reprofiled corner in it, because all the ones that I've driven had the original corner in it, and which could be pretty tricky and
Mhm.
kind of a medium speed blast. But yeah, definitely made for some very exciting racing.
Right. So do you want to talk
And
through Mercedes and them coming back from midfield?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean it was absolutely, a brilliant 2-3-4 Mercedes. Hamilton drove a fantastic race, got a really great start, kept his, Mercedes played the strategy just perfect to keep Hamilton in position. And you got to give lots of props to Russell, who stormed from 12th on the grid after a so-so qualifying run to wind up as third on the podium. That's a pretty impressive resurgence after the kind of dismal showing that they had at the beginning of the year.
Right. Yeah, it just goes to show how much those upgrades really are paying off now. Both drivers are consistently getting up in the top tiers now, and we're actually seeing Hamilton and really Russell drive pretty much to where they were before. Before the new regulations came out for the cars. It's good to see we have another contender in the upper field and in the top field now. Although they're not really chasing Max at this point, they hopefully will be getting there fairly soon. They're at least getting to that point where they're contenders. If Max does a mess up, or if there's any type of car issue, possibly within the next couple of upgrades, maybe they start leading the Grand Prix from now on. So it's
Yeah,
wide open. It's very good to see that they are making that much progress in truly such a short amount of time.
absolutely. In my opinion, it's Red Bull and then Aston Martin, which they've done just from the beginning of the season, Spain notwithstanding. And they've
Yeah.
done just a fantastic job. And the margin between Red Bull and Aston Martin right now is razor thin. It's if Red Bull cocks up the strategy in some way, or if they have some kind of mechanical issue, Aston Martin's going to be right there to pounce. And with the upgrades that they're making, not just on the cars, but also with the personnel, it's not going to be long before they're not just going to be nipping at Red Bull's heels. They're going to be pouncing on Red Bull, and
Right.
which I think is fantastic. But having said that, I think that Mercedes has definitely done a tremendous job in closing up the gap between up
Right.
to Aston Martin. And like you said, if the upgrades continue to come and they're continuing to unlock speed out of the car at the rate that they've done with the first set of upgrades, they could very well, pull level, if not surpass Aston Martin.
Very easily. You have the talent there, and the drivers. Now you get the technology to match that. It's going to be like 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, where they were unbeatable, right? They're
Yeah,
like what Red Bull is or has been so far.
definitely know that with the personnel that Mercedes has, with all of the intelligence and fantastic designers, great mechanics, you knew that they weren't going to stay down for
Oh
long.
yeah, no
So
doubt about
that
it.
you knew definitely Mercedes was definitely not going to become a Williams, where at one point they were at the top of the grid and now they're at the back end.
There's just no
It's
way.
definitely
Yeah,
not going to be a situation like that. It would take something much more drastic, and we'll talk about this in future podcasts. We'll talk about the rise and the fall of Williams and how the regulation changes in the early 2000s are really what killed Williams and took them from being at the pinnacle of the sport to being the perennial back markers. But again, like I said, we'll talk about that in a future podcast. So let's talk about the upgrades and how Mercedes got there. And what we're going to do is we're going to start doing a segment what I'm referring to as Tech Corner, where we're going to talk about a specific part of the technology involved in the sport and how it relates to, not just to today's news, but also how it goes back to the history of the sport. So today we're going to talk about side pods, which was one of the biggest, most visible upgrades that Mercedes made to the car. For those there who don't know, Mercedes started out the year with what they referred to as their zero side pod. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with what a side pod is, the side pod is on each side of the driver's monocoque, which is the area where the driver sits. So if you're looking at the Formula One car from the front, the side pods are the part that extends out past the area where the driver sits and reaches back towards the back wheels. And Mercedes came out last year when the regulations changed. They came out with what they referred to as their zero side pod, which was a side pod that had a very, very small and low profile. So if you looked at, it was extremely different from what all the rest of the teams had done. And the side pods are generally used to feed air into the radiators for the cooling of the engines, and but they're also used for aerodynamics as well. And with the updated regulations last year, the side pods became very integral in channeling the air around the sides of the car and channeling the air underneath the car into the ground effects. And we're not going to go into ground effects today. We're going to save that for that conversation for Canada. But again, it was a way for them to manage the air as it came around the side, not just through the side pods into the radiators, but around the side pods and around the wheels, and how it fed into the beam wing for the rear wing that we've talked about in previous episodes. With the latest upgrades, Mercedes went away from the zero side pod concept because the way that the aero was working around such a low profile area, because they technically had minimal side pods. They only had just an area just big enough for the radiator intakes, and then everything dropped away. And because of that, it made it the air as it came around the front wheels and around the cockpit, it took and channeled the air onto the upper part of the floor, which worked really well in the previous iteration of the rules. But with this one, it became too hard for it to take and properly manage the air as it went around the bottom of the car. And that's the reason why, for most of the part last year, the Mercedes had the worst time with the porpoising effect. So with the change in the new side pods, they went to a more traditional side pod that looked very much like the Aston Martin and Red Bull side pods, where you would have the air intake at the upper part of the side pod, and then there's a channel underneath so that when the air comes around the wheels in the cockpit, it takes and channels some of the air into the air intakes for the radiators, and it channels the rest of it through those tunnels underneath the air intakes, and then pushes that air underneath the car, which then takes and pulls it through the diffuser and around the back wing. By doing that, it takes and it minimizes the porpoising, because with the way that the aero was on the old Mercedes, is it made it much more susceptible to, and for those of you who don't know what the porpoising is, just in a nutshell, basically what it is that as the car is going along, the air travels underneath the car, it takes and creates a low air effect, which causes the car to lower towards the ground until the point where the car would actually get so close to the ground that it would actually hit the tarmac, and then cause the suspension to then rebound and pop back up. And it would go through a cycle of that where it would take and just constantly it would suck it down, bounce up, suck it down, bounce up. And last year, as we saw, Mercedes had probably some of the worst porpoising, to the point where there was one race where I believe it was Lewis actually had complained after the race so bad because they literally had to lift him out of the car because he was so sore. There's not a lot of padding in those seats. There's almost zero padding in the seats, and they are form fitted for each individual driver. Something like the porpoising would cause a lot of back pain if you're doing 200 miles with that constant bouncing off of the tarmac. So the new side pods, it's helped tremendously with the aero on the Mercedes, which has helped tremendously with their return to form.
Yeah, going back to Hamilton, he could barely walk when he got out of that car. It was disturbing to see how much pain, because we all know how much those drivers go through just in a race itself, right? I mean, they have to deal with all the G's, they have to deal with all the braking, all that they have to deal with in their body. Watching him walk like that, I was really upsetting to see. But like you said before, just glad that they have that fixed, and it's actually much better now with Mercedes.
Yes, very much so. So to going from resurgence, let's talk about the fall off with Aston Martin. This is the first race that we had where Alonso was not on the podium, finished up in 7th, and Stroll, actually for the first time this year, actually out-qualified and outperformed his teammate, brought it home in 6th. Was not his best performance of the year. I believe he had a 5th in, I believe it was either Jeddah or Monaco, I think. I'd have to check my facts on that. It's definitely not up to Alonso's speed. Definitely a great showing for Stroll.
So what do you think attributed to that? Was it just the track itself? Was it just a bad day?
I think that they just had a bad day. Alonso didn't qualify well at all. I think they got the setup just completely wrong for the track. But I can't attribute it how they got it so wrong. I can't point my finger at any one thing, because it's not like the weather played into it, because it was dry the entire weekend. It wasn't because of any one particular issue. I just don't think they were on the stick that week, and it showed. And again, Aston Martin is a team that has started off the year really, really strong. You still have to think that Aston Martin, even though they have a long history in the sport, the team itself, if you go through the history of Aston Martin, started off as Jordan Racing, in the 90s, was later bought out, and it's gone through, several other iterations, through Stryker for 1 year, Force Point, Force India. You've had all these changes of ownership since the Jordan days until now. So you kind of have to think of Aston Martin as an old team that's still going through growing pains. So Lawrence Stroll has thrown a ton of money at this team, and he wants to bring it to the forefront of the grid. And he is he came to the realization that, which a lot of people could have told him, that you're going to have the personnel. And I think it's all of the changes in the personnel, not specifically before this race, but just the different people working with each other and everything. Occasionally, right now, this year, I kind of expect 1 or 2 races where they're going to just be kind of lost in the weeds. But because they're so strong, they're still going to have a respectable showing, just not what we've been used to so far this year.
because again, Aston Martins, they're the ones that hoping is like the dark horse, right? The ones that will always be present, always hopefully pushing Max a little bit or chasing Checo. Hopefully, once he starts placing a little bit higher. Love Alonso. You know, I love watching him race. He's very methodical, not only in his racing, but how he approaches things. It's more cerebral watching him race versus because he's not just racing. He's looking at everybody else, putting it in context, and he's either pushing somebody really hard so they use their tires up, or he's watching people behind him to make sure distance wise that he's doing what he needs to do to keep his place or move up a few places. So love watching his strategies.
I totally agree. I love watching Alonso work. I've made the joke before. I think even on this podcast, I've made the joke that Alonso's playing 4D chess while everybody else is playing checkers.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it's somebody else came up, and I wished I could remember who said it, but it was probably one of the best quotes from earlier this year when Alonso was in second place and he's watching I think it was at Miami, where Alonso is in third place. He's watching, and he's so cerebral and such a precision driver but so instinctive that he literally could look up and watch the big screen at one of the corners and saw Lance pull off a really nice move, and he's actually able to relay that over the radio. I mean, but somebody made the quote that said Alonso only uses about 10 or 20% of his brain to actually drive the car, and the rest of it is driving other drivers' races for them so that he knows where they're going to mess up or or if they screw up their strategy, how he can take advantage of it and everything. So yes, he's so much fun to watch now. I will admit that early on in his career, when he was really young, he wasn't quite as methodical as he is now. And it was a little hard to like him early on in his career, but he has matured. He's still blindingly fast. At 41 years old, he is still blindingly quick. The way that his brain works and everything is just to go along with his all-out speed makes him just so much fun to watch. And I'm so happy to see him back at the sharp end of the grid.
Couldn't agree more. He's so fun to watch, and again, just he's amazing to watch in that what he can do and his overall vision of what's happening on the track, not just in front of him and behind him, but all over. It's just it's amazing.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely is. So barring like a Michael Schumacher early 2000s type situation where Max is in an accident, breaks his leg or something, and he's out of the car for a couple weeks, where Checo or Alonso can start making some ground on him, in the championship. I think Max is pretty much going to probably run away with it this year. But if Aston Martin continues to build and nip at Red Bull's heels, I think that definitely next year Alonso, even at 42 years old, is going to still be able to. He's going to be able to take it to the young guns, very much so, which I think would be very cool, and maybe give us our oldest world champion. It could be. Wow. I think that if anybody could do it, Alonso could do it.
Completely agree with that. So on to Ferrari and McLaren.
Oh,
Ferrari. I'm sorry to all the Ferrari fans. Ferrari.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts around their qualifying pace versus their race pace? What they're lacking in the race? I mean, we're not really truly looking at efficiency and strategy like what we did last year. I mean, are you thinking this is more along the lines of the car and its technology? Or are you thinking this is some issues with the drivers themselves? What are your thoughts on their performance?
Well, in this particular case, it's just such a mixed bag with everything with Ferrari. It's Sainz qualifies second, but then falls off. His race pace was horrible, but then you had Leclerc qualifies in 19th, takes I believe they ended up having to change the gearbox, so he ends up starting from the pit lane. Just had an absolutely disastrous qualifying. Just all kinds of mechanical gremlins, takes and leaves Leclerc, at the back of the grid, out in Q1 and everything. He, and he really didn't do much in the race itself. I forget where Leclerc finished, but it was a completely forgettable race for Ferrari. Sights just completely dropped off. You know, Leclerc winds up, I don't even remember. I'll have to check my notes here in a minute. But yeah, it was just I think it's a combination of a couple things. I think that this year's car is a little more difficult to set up. I think some of the changes that they made during the off season haven't really panned out. I think that in some of the other upgrades that are going to come this year is I think that they're going to take and go back to what was working on the car last year, and they're basically going to scrap what they changed this year in certain parts of the car. Believe me, but I don't profess to know specifically what they changed on the car that has made it so much harder to get a handle on this year. But I think that it's going to be kind of a regression to push forward. So they're going to go back to the part that worked and then push forward in a different direction to fix those issues.
That's costly, not only
yes,
dollars or pounds perspective or euros, depending on where you are, but just costing an amount of time. They're losing an entire season.
So just Ferrari has just gone through periods of feast and famine where they'll go through years like the early 2000s, and where they have a brilliant driver, a brilliant technical team, brilliant designers and engineers, and they're just unbeatable. And it never seems to be a gradual decline with them. It's like they'll go and be at the absolute pinnacle, and then they'll drop off, and then they'll spend a number of years in the wilderness, and then they'll come back up. And that's the way that Ferrari has been in their 70 plus years in Formula One. I think we're kind of seeing them in the drop off mode at the moment. So, which is I'm like you, especially for the long suffering Ferrari fans, I hate to hear that. And I
Right.
could be wrong. They could end up riding the ship. Now, do I think that they're going to be able to do any better than fourth in the championship this year? I doubt very seriously, but we shall see. But let's talk about another team that I just don't even know what to make of it. That you mentioned before, we were going to talk about McLaren. I don't know what to make of them. I mean, it's like Norris, at Spain qualified, has an absolutely brilliant qualifies third on the grid, but then he takes and gets punted off at like at the second corner by Hamilton, which, as much as I hate to say it, Hamilton was at fault. Now, it was deemed a racing incident, and it really was a racing incident, but saying Hamilton was at fault isn't exactly the right word to use. But it's definitely, had not been for Hamilton, well, Norris definitely wouldn't have gotten punted off the track. Now, whether he would have finished on the podium, I still highly doubt it, because it broke the front wing on the car.
Mm-hmm.
He goes into the pits, comes back out in, I believe it was either 18th or 19th place, gets past, I believe it was debris, and then he's stuck in a DRS train behind Albon and Granu and a whole string of cars. And for some reason, the McLaren just does not work well in traffic right now. So, as we've seen before, that when the car is out in clean air, especially during qualifying, it can be quite good. And Norris is a top tier driver. I mean, I would definitely put Norris in the same. Yeah. I mean, I would definitely put him in the same breath as, Verstappen and Hamilton and Alonso and even Leclerc. But he just doesn't seem to ever have the equipment. And it makes me wonder, how long is he going to be willing to put up with this from McLaren if somebody like Ferrari comes knocking, or if whatever, one of the other top teams comes knocking, how much loyalty is Norris going to have? But that's another conversation for another day. I mean, he like I said, he fades, away even after, getting punted off, fades to 17. Piastri isn't able to, muster anything better than 13th, after he also had a pretty good qualifying run, but he again faded during the race. And then it seems to be that's the problem, is in qualifying trim, the McLaren seems to be pretty good. The problem is that in race trim, it's just not the same car. It's just a completely different beast, it seems.
Right.
And you would think that with a team that has, because McLaren, when it comes to resources and great mechanics and designers and engineers working on the team, I mean, they're right up there with the Red Bulls and the Aston Martins and the Ferraris and the Mercedes. They have the, gobs of money, just like those top teams do. For them to not be in a better position, it's just mind boggling to me. A team that's, has, multiple world championships at many points during its life have been just on the top of the grid and absolutely unstoppable. For them to be where they're at and to be lost in the wilderness for so long, like they have been for the last 7-8 years, is just mind boggling to me. I know I keep using that word, but I just can't seem to wrap my head around where McLaren has fallen to.
I am a Norris fan. I think he drives just like what you were saying earlier. Norris, I definitely put up there in the top tier drivers. He just doesn't have a top tier car, despite being part of McLaren in their history. That car just isn't there, right? So you put him in another car, a Mercedes. You put him in just like what you're saying. What happens if, say, Lewis retires next year? He won't, but let's say for just giggles today that he retires or something happens to one of the Ferrari drivers. He's an easy shoe-in. Who wouldn't want him to? But
Absolutely.
Then again, like your point, would he leave Zach? Would he see that as a betrayal? I know that he's gotten offers. I know Red Bull's come after him a couple of times. When Gasly was fading away at Red Bull, when Albon was fading away as well. I know he's been approached a few times by Horner. He wasn't able to move him then, but that was a few years ago. I'm sure Norris is hungry and he's wanting to get a title, or at least be higher up in the championship. So we'll see. That would be an interesting deal, right? Great for the silly season.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. With Lewis being on the will he or won't he, train at the moment, that it seems like the last few years we've gotten every year with him just signing single year contracts with Mercedes. Then it's definitely, at what point is Lewis going to call it a day? Now, the thing is that now they're all of a sudden that they're seeming to lock, 0.2 of a second, half a second with these upgrades. I see Lewis. I definitely have seen a change in Lewis in his demeanor, and he is definitely much more engaged now than he was, especially towards the end of last season. You could tell he was just beat down, not just by physically from the car, but from the mental point of view. And he, especially in the last two races, his engagement and his the bounce in his step is definitely back. So but like you said, if Lewis does decide that hey, it was fun this year, car got a lot better, but I'm done, or or maybe he wants to take a 2 or 3 year sabbatical, kind of like what Alonso did, and decides I'm going to step away for a couple of years and go enjoy my toys and and things like that, and go maybe pursue other interests and stuff. He's very interested in fashion and things like that. It's like at what point does he decide that hey, I want to go play around for a little bit. Maybe I'll take a year away. And make some kind of deal with Toto that says, hey, I'm going to go away for a year, but I want an option to be able to come back the following year. That if I decide I want to come back, you'll open up a seat for me, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it's definitely going to make the silly season much, much more interesting than normal.
Like last year.
Yes.
Yeah. I love what you said about Hamilton's demeanor, because you definitely saw it, right? I mean, he was experiencing so much, not only from the car and his pace and everything, but he was experiencing so much negativity from the press, from maybe from fans as well, but hearing that all the time. Hey, what's Lewis doing? He's so far behind. He's not to the pace of George and everything like that. Surely that also leads into
that ADAD.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially at the beginning of the season where he had a couple mechanical issues. There was a couple times he was way off the pace, and you had Russell his much younger teammate, although very highly touted, his teammate was outperforming him, and what was it, the first, I think he had a streak of finishing in the top 5 in the first, I want to say it was like the first 7 or 8 races last year. That had to eat at
Oh,
Hamilton.
no doubt about it. Yeah, 100%.
Yep.
Especially knowing what kind of competitor he is, there's no
Mm-hmm.
way he was going home sleeping well at night. There's just no way.
No, absolutely not.
So it's great. I love what you said, because that really puts it into perspective. His demeanor last year versus what he is today, this year,
Yes.
he looks more like the Lewis Hamilton of 2020, 2019, and even before
Mm-hmm.
that, right? He looks like the Hamilton that everybody knows as being the true competitor and champion.
Absolutely.
So Red Bull, speaking of champions.
Yes, absolutely.
I feel a little bad, being quite honest. I feel a little bit bad that I said Hamilton and Red Bull's name so close together. That kind of hurt a little bit. But let's talk about Red Bull. Let's change subjects a little bit. Let's talk about Red Bull. Dominance
Okay.
yet again. Yet
Yes.
another track that they're just dominant. Max was up how many seconds this time? I mean, people couldn't even see his dust at this point, right?
No, he finished 20 something seconds clear of Hamilton. It's just, I mean, almost half a track.
Yeah,
It was almost half the distance of the track that he was ahead of Hamilton when he took the checkered flag. So it was just a brilliant wire to wire finish. He, took and got an absolutely storming start, where nobody was, even able to even remotely, Sainz kind of tried to challenge him, but once he got ahead of Sainz, got into, turn 4 and 5, he was gone. Once he was out in clear air, he just built up a tremendous lead. Red Bull played the pit strategy to perfection for Verstappen. And in the end, it was just another brilliant wire to wire win for Verstappen. It's like right now, he just looks absolutely unstoppable.
right.
Now, having said that, as we've talked about many times before in the past, people have said, hey, is this going to be the way it is for the entire year? And I keep telling people, relax. As we talked about a couple podcasts ago, I still don't think that Red Bull will win every single race this year. Something's going to happen. Either one of the cars is going to get, is going to be in a lead, and they're going to get tangled up with somebody on the start or on a restart or something like that, and they're going to get punted off into the kitty litter, and their day's going to be done, or they're going to have some issue, especially now. As we've talked about in the past, now that the cars have to last so much longer than they did back in earlier eras of Formula One, they're running right. Sometimes those gearboxes and those engines, they say, okay, we can take this engine for another 400 miles before we're going to have to change it out. And at 300 miles, it says, nope, I'm done. When they hit that 300-mile mark, that's when it's 10 laps left in the race. It's going to be some kind of situation like that. So
Right.
I don't think that they're going to win every one, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility, though, that if they're as smart as Red Bull is, there's going to be a few more of these wire to wire wins for Verstappen and possibly even Checo, because Checo also had a pretty piss poor qualifying effort and was able to come back to a brilliant 4th place again through a really, really good car. Because one of the things that a lot of people have talked about, and is still now, Aston Martin and Mercedes are getting much closer to them, but the one thing that Red Bull has had that's given them such a clear advantage is under DRS, they are able to slipstream past cars in a way they don't get caught up in those DRS trains. I still, there's a lot of people who don't like the DRS system, but I still think that the DRS system is very good. It has its place, but it is a problem sometimes when you've got 3 or 4 cars that are running nose to tail in a DRS train where they've all got DRS on each other and nobody can seem to make any ground. Now, the problem is that I see with that, though, is it's also an issue of, what about that lead car? Why isn't the car that has DRS that's behind the lead car that doesn't have DRS? Why are they not getting around them?
Yep.
Well, with the Red Bulls, that doesn't seem to be a problem.
Hmm.
It seems like every time they have DRS, within a lap or two, they're around the guy in front of them because they're
Easily.
just so much better. We very rarely have ever seen a team that goes wire to wire that dominant. There's only been a couple times, Ferrari, in the early 2000s, McLaren in 83, where they won 15 out of 16 races. Most of the time, it's going to be more like 2013 with Braun GP, who had a very brilliant car to start out the year, but by the end of the year, everybody was catching up with him. The Ferraris and the Mercedes were catching up to not Mercedes, because Mercedes bought Braun and rebranded themselves. So, but Ferrari and even Williams back at that point was still, very much sharp into the grid, and they definitely made strides towards the end of the year. But by that point, Braun had built up such a lead in the Constructors' Championship, and Jenson Button had done such a brilliant job of maximizing points at the beginning of the season that even at the end, nobody could catch him. But you definitely did not see them being a wire to wire winner every single race like you did at the beginning of the year. And I think that I have a sneaking suspicion that with the way that Mercedes has come on and the way that Aston Martin has come good since the beginning of the season, I definitely see them really closing that gap to Red Bull much more.
Yes.
We're going to have a lot more close to racing towards the end of the season. But again, I think that at this point, Red Bull has built up too much of a lead that unless they really screw something up, I don't see them relinquishing that lead this year. But I definitely
Right.
see that the fight for second, third, fourth in the Constructors' Championship this year is going to be really, really tight and really, really hard fought.
Still talking about Red Bull going to Checo. So this was another race that his quali was not great, being nice about it, but he was able to finish fourth.
Yes.
While his qualities are not great, he's able to pull through, attributing a
Yes.
lot of this to Red Bull's race pace, to Red Bull's DRS being able to really effectively use that slipstream and use DRS effectively. And Checo, just being the madman that he is, he's a phenomenal driver. He's able to make up places very quickly, right? So he
Yes.
finished fourth. Fantastic drive again by Checo. Thoughts?
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I wish I could put my finger on the reason why Checo doesn't seem to be qualifying as well right now as he did at the beginning of the year. Um, I can't put my finger on any one particular thing. And I don't think it has anything to do with him. I think it has to do maybe with communication with the team. I just don't know. And with that being said, I'm not going to speculate any further. But again, one of the things that we've talked about before, and I'm sure that we will talk about again, is the brilliance of Checo once he gets into a race, is that he has a fight in him that I don't see in a lot of other drivers. It's like even some of the world champions that they're too easily willing to take what they can get in a race, whereas Checo just doesn't accept that. He says, no, I know that I've got, if my teammate, and in this case, Verstappen, is qualifying first, I may have had a bad qualifying and I qualified seventh or eighth, but I'm going to do everything in my power during the race to get as close to him as I possibly can because I know that it's possible. He's able to do that in such a way that just defies logic. But he is just such a brilliant driver, and he is such a great foil for Max that when he qualifies well, I see him being able to be every bit the measure of Verstappen. I know there's a lot
Yeah,
of people that would argue with me and say that no, he's a really, really good number two, but I don't see it that way. I see him as being
same here.
every bit the measure of Verstappen. Right now he just doesn't seem to have the consistency that Verstappen has.
Exactly. Moving on to non F1 news. You're wanting to talk about Vettel and Danny Rick?
Oh yeah. So for those of you who haven't seen the news, in a couple weeks, Vettel is going to be reunited with the RB17 that he won the second of his four world championships with. He's going to take and go pound around the Nürburgring, not around the Grand Prix circuit. He's going around the Green Hell. So he is going to do all 14 miles around the Nordschleife part of the Nürburgring in the Red Bull. He's doing it again, kind of like what he did a few weeks ago, where he drove the old Williams FW16, which was driven by Nigel Mansell, but he used it as a demonstration of the sustainable e-fuel that Porsche and Shell and a couple of the other energy companies have been touting. And this is going to be the first time that we're going to see a modernish Formula One car. Yes, it's still, 7-8 years old. But this is the first time that we're going to see a modernish Formula One car running on the e-fuel. And we're going to get to see it really, because Formula One cars have not run on the Nordschleife part of the Nürburgring in, I want to say it's been almost 30 years since the last time they ran there. And so this is going to be really exciting to see. And it's also going to be really cool because on the same day, Daniel Ricciardo is going to get to run around the Nordschleife as well in his FW18 that he drove when he was teammates with Vettel. We're going to get to see Danny Rick back in a Formula One car, and we're going to get to see Vettel back behind the wheel of a Formula One car, and we're going to get to see him running around the Nürburgring, which is just going to be super exciting. I can't wait to see that. All right, next time around, we're going to talk about the ground effects, modern day ground effects, and how they relate to the ground effects of the bygone era in Formula One. So it's time to push our way out of here and get back to the garage. We'll come to you next in a couple days from Canada. And so until next time, for Corey Brune, I'm Scott Vick saying keep it out of the kitty litter.